because LEAF petitioned the UN recently to remove PA from the index, and they succeeded. And they were, I'm pretty sure they were citing the Meyer study. And so,
yeah, well, let me explain that one.
okay,
Because so it's the World Health Organization publishes ICD-11, and the debate there was simply to see if PA could be included not as a health code classification. So ICD-11 is the consensus worldwide index of medical and psychological disorders, and they do have a, chapter 24 is basically factors influencing health status or contact with health services. And it's within chapter 24 that there's some room to look at, family relational matters. So
well,
the
I consider it
actual
a mental health issue, especially in children. This
yes.
Severe mental health problem and a long-lasting one.
Okay, so no one's debating that. The question is, how's the World Health Organization going to deal with this dynamic? Okay, there are a lot of childhood traumas, and many of you would be familiar with the concept of adverse child experiences. Very, very broad.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us interested in this area are interested in quite a pervasive dynamic. You have only to look at my good friend Dr. Jen Harmon's prevalence studies and the prevalence studies of Klawar and Rivlin, who did the 1,000 family study for the American Bar Association, and their book's called Children Held Hostage, currently in its second edition. So we know it's serious. We know it's very broad-based. Up to a third of adults have had direct or indirect exposure to this. And we know it's a major social ill and a drag on society's resources. So it's not to be minimized. Whether or not you find the term in ICD-11 does not detract from PA's legitimacy or the way courts should respond to it. Courts have been responding either effectively or ineffectively, or effectively but too late, long before there was even a proposal to get it into ICD-11. So it's important to understand the background. So in the context of the other book, the big blue book, the DSM-5, which is the Bible of the mental health community, with its coding, as many of you know, my good friend and colleague, Professor Bernet, led a whole team making a formal presentation that PA be recognized in ICD-11, in DSM-5. And while that was not successful, there are about 4 or 5 DSM-5 codes that, without using the term, clearly refer to the type of situation that we find in these families. So in that sense, the battle is won. But it's important to look at this whole issue of ICD-11 and DSM-5 in the following way. There was a condition first described after the First World War called shell shock. And anybody exposed to assisting those who put their lives on the line for us knew what shell shock was, and treatments were starting to be developed, etc. And it only got its formal designation of post-traumatic stress disorder and entry into the DSM many decades after it was first identified and studied. So is the fact that for all those years, shell shock under any name was not a recognized psychological disorder, did it detract from its legitimacy? Of course not. And are there certain mental health problems that were characterized one way and then reconceptualized and suddenly characterized another way? Does that detract from the underlying seriousness of the matter? No, it doesn't. So it's important to bear all this in mind. And now let me restate what actually happened with ICD-11 so that you'll see it was never in the first place. And this was not going to give it any real legitimacy because, as I said, it's focused on health disorders. And the only place that you could find a reference would be in Chapter 24, Factors Influencing Health Status. There's an entry in the ICD-11 for caregiver-child relationship problem. PA was going to simply be an example of that. So simply an index term. So it's going to, when you're explaining what is meant by a caregiver-child relationship problem, one of the examples would be parental alienation. So that's a truism. There's certainly a caregiver-child relationship problem there.
Mm-hmm.
And this was just going to be an example of that, and therefore it would be what's called an index term because all terms used in the actual coding or examples of the coding get indexed.
Okay.
And incorporation of a term that way never indicated the World Health Organization endorsement or any sort of formal recognition. It was only an acknowledgement. It's a term that you may run into in healthcare settings and therefore may need to be classified. And the particular committee, the Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee of the World Health Organization, had studied the issue, and in September 2019 said that it's in that context. So that, of course, in parallel with that, a group of PA deniers from around the world were working on this collective memo of concern. So this is not Meyer, this is not Leaf, it's a whole bunch of them from around the world, although some of it was spearheaded here in Canada, actually. They published this thing and lobbied the WHO. And long story short, ultimately in February 2020, a decision was made not to include it in the very limited context that it was going to be included. And even though there's still some debate, is it a healthcare term? Is it not? What is it? So in that sense, it's a tempest in a teapot. And what's really interesting to me about this whole thing is why the effort. They are so afraid to give any legitimacy to what insightful judges are saying. You don't even have to bring any expert evidence. The courts take judicial notice of it. And yet they are so afraid that even an offhand reference to it in ICD-11 was throwing them into a tizzy and led to a whole worldwide thing and comments being posted. And basically, they created enough noise that the WHO said, you know, we don't need this. It's not really adding anything to our publication. It was just an example so that if some family doctor in a country that doesn't have a lot of knowledge of this came across the term and they went looking in their Bible for like, what is this? They'd at least see the reference. That's really all this was. And so the lesson is, if they're that worried, the denier community, that they would put this sort of effort in and their document, the collective objection document, it's about 200 pages long, is so filled with just stuff that is absolutely untenable, wrong, twisted, misleading, shameful, it exposes them for who they are. And the signatories to that document know who they are. And I would welcome a debate with any of them at any time.